I will get down, folks looking at Adult Forum, I will get down to the altar and be there in just a second. Please bear with me. Can you grab the white things off the pulpit thing? Yes, this one also. I don't understand it. Do you want the flowers up? Do you want the flowers left on? No. Okay. Just bring it all back in here. Thank you very much. Let me grab my thing and a chair. Okay. And there's a 10-second lag, so you can see Christine right now, but it's actually showing. On YouTube, there's always a 10-second lag.
Yeah, yeah, we just walked by. That's coming.
Oh, and they're going to see us in about 10 seconds, right?
Well, they've been looking at you.
Yes.
Say hello.
Hello.
Hey. Let's see. I think that maybe I will. I need my microphone. I'm sorry.
Just bring it back to the table.
Sorry, folks. I'm going to edit all of this out, but you live people get to see behind the scenes. And
My slip.
so, do we have any watchers? We do have somebody watching. So, welcome to Adult Forum.
Thank you.
So long, Mulaney.
Bye.
Could you shut that door?
Yeah.
Thanks. So today's topic is Colonial, We Are Not Alone. It's a 2021 series that will reveal the ELCA and how Lutherans are networked. And today's, in understanding and discovering what it means to be one church in three expressions. Today's particular aspect is colonial and early American Lutherans and their networks. So when I say the word church, what do you think of? When I say the word church, what do you think of? Many people think of a congregation, Zion Lutheran Church, right? And when the Apostle Paul wrote to communities of Christians, he often wrote to the church in Rome, and so that we, in shorthand, call it Romans, or to the church, but his greeting is to the saints in Corinth, or to the church in Corinth. Although many times in his letters, he's writing to a number of different communities in a certain region. So it would be like writing to the churches in Morris County or Warren County. But there are times when he says to the church in Corinth, for example. But Ephesus and Galatia are regions and not particular towns. But particularly when he writes to an area that's a city, more urban, he says to the church in Rome or to the church in Corinth. The tricky thing, though, when we equate church with a congregation, is we can tend to think that it belongs to someone, to someone or a powerful group of people, like a founding pastor, or like a group within a congregation that thinks because that they are very active or big givers that they're in charge, it's their church, instead of God's church. The worst thing, though, is when a pastor says, "This is my church." Bad thing. But church can be thought of as a congregation. Sometimes when we think of the word church, we think of worship or the building. I'm going to church this morning, or I'm going to church to drop off, food for the collection. And this is just kind of a development in the English language where we equate church with the building or with a time of gathering like worship. So what does church mean? What does church mean? The word Kirchen sounded to our Anglo-Saxon German ancestors like Kirche, Kirchen, Kirche, which is how we ended up with the word church, Kirche, kirk, church. But the root Latin word Kirchen has the word Kyrie as the root. And Kyrie means Lord. So Kirchen from Latin means belonging to the Lord, or that which is the Lord's, church. Going back earlier than Latin, than ancient Christians, Greek and the New Testament, the word used for church is ekklesia, which means those who have been called out. But it usually means more than one congregation. If you remember when Jesus tells Peter, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. You are rocky, and on this rock I will build my church. That is, Protestants consider it to be on Peter's confession, not on Peter the person. Obviously, Jesus is not talking about one congregation when he builds his church on Peter's confession of faith, but something much bigger. On this rock I will build my church. Most often in the New Testament, church means more than one congregation. It's something broader. It's the followers of Jesus in different areas. Another example of church as bigger than a congregation is in current practice. If you're baptized, you don't get baptized as a Lutheran or as a Presbyterian or as a Roman Catholic. You get baptized Christian. And we all recognize one another's baptism. So if you get baptized in a Presbyterian church, Roman Catholics, most Christians will recognize it. There are particular Christians who ascribe to a small group of Christians, which is actually bigger now, but it's historically more recent, Baptists. And there are others who in history go ascribe to a believer's baptism, that a person has to believe before getting baptized. So outside of Baptists and other who ascribe to believer's baptism, if you get baptized in a church by any denomination, you're baptized, and we all recognize it. So you're baptized a Christian. You get baptized into the church, into Christ, not into one congregation or one denomination. And when another example of the church being bigger than a congregation is that's kind of, if you've ever traveled around the world and visited a church in a different country where you can't understand the language, if it's a Lutheran church and they're following a Lutheran liturgy or even a Roman Catholic or Episcopalian liturgy, you'll kind of recognize what's happening at church during the time. You'll recognize when people say, "The Lord be with you," and also with you, kneeling, and you'll kind of know where you're at within the worship service, within the liturgy, just because you've been to church, you've been to worship, and you've experienced that. So we have that connection. When I went to Mexico way back for a vacation right up after college to Rocky Point, Mexico, I was in seminary at the time, and I decided to go to church on Sunday. And so I went to church at Roman Catholic Church, and it was amazing to be able to worship with people. Even though I couldn't understand the language, I kind of knew what was happening, and felt connected with folks in Mexico who I never met. Same when we traveled to Taiwan and met all sorts of Taiwanese and China and Singapore, Hong Kong, I should say, and Singapore. We met all sorts of folks who were Christian, who were from the Lutheran tradition and just had this deep connection to them in a way that I wouldn't have had I just met them not doing a church trip. Tim and I traveled there as Tim was asked to speak in 2017 for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So this sense of church being bigger than a congregation was apparent to Henry Melchior Muhlenberg when he, who was not only the first pastor of this congregation, but also is considered to be the father of Lutheranism in what became the United States of America. This was when we were but colonies and British subjects. Muhlenberg, I'm worried I'm going to call him Luther. Muhlenberg was a pastor and also a teacher at an institution in Halle, Germany. He was called by 3 congregations in Pennsylvania, right near Philadelphia. One was in Trapp, one was in Philadelphia, and one was in New Hanover, Pennsylvania. He was called by them to be their pastor. They were looking for a pastor. There was a shortage of pastors in the colonies, and they called him in Halle, Germany, to be their pastor. And Muhlenberg came here via England in order to be authorized to do that by the chaplain to King George II. I think I have that right, to King George II. Who the King of England actually was also the Prince of Hanover, where Muhlenberg was from. And so there was a connection that he had, but also so there was not only a connection to the Prince of Hanover, the king being the King of England, but also the colonies to which he was going to travel to be pastor were a British colony. And so he needed authorization, and he wanted that proper order and authorization, and got it from the chaplain to the King of England. So he stopped over in England, then traveled, and eventually landed in Pennsylvania after a very harrowing trip by sea. He got caught, there were a number of storms. And he discovered upon arrival a number of things. It was kind of chaos in the colonies, as it is whenever there's kind of a settling in a new area and there's no order and so forth. But in the church community, there was a shortage of pastors. There was a problem with discipline among pastors and also among congregations. There were also people claiming to be pastors, he called them fake pastors, who never were ordained in Germany and never were educated to be a pastor or trained to be a pastor. That's kind of how it happened. But claimed to be a pastor. Somehow on the trip over from Germany to the colonies, they all of a sudden became ordained. So there were a lot of fake pastors running around. They wanted jobs. They wanted a secure job, and they had some, upbringing in the church and claimed to be pastors, but didn't have the training. There were also conflicts within congregations, and there was disunity because Germans came over from different areas in Germany, and the different areas in Germany had different dialects. Some Germans couldn't understand one another from one area in the colonies to another. They also had different hymnals in Germany, different catechisms, so so he sensed a need for order and continuity, consistency, that's a better word, that's what I was looking for, and also discipline and training, ordination. And he ended up founding the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. Over the course of many years, conversations, conflicts, and also offering to support congregations. And we don't know really much about Muhlenberg's theology or even much about his preaching, but we know by his letters that he was very pragmatic. He was a faithful administrator, organizer, and bridge builder. So not only did he build bridges among Germans in the colonies, but he built a bridge from England to the colonies and also from Germany to the colonies, to the churches being built. He built bridges not only of training, finding ordained ministers, and then training ministers on the ground here in the colonies, but he also got financial support from Germany. Let's see, what did he do? Germans were poor, like everybody was pretty much, most people in the colonies were poor and kind of scratching to survive and find livings. A lot of the founding fathers eventually, decades down the road, a number of our presidents died bankrupt and so forth. It was just a very turbulent time in terms of finances. So there was very little money. And another interesting thing was that congregation at that point were not legal entities. So a congregation could not get a mortgage, could not borrow money. So the trustees, what we would now call the council, would personally have to borrow money to get a mortgage to be able to build a congregation, a physical congregation, a building, I should say, not a congregation. The congregation is the people. But in order to physically build a building, they would have to borrow personally. And some of them ended up going bankrupt. So in addition to the education and trying to create a new hymnal and a unified catechism among Lutherans in the colonies, he also was able to get funding from Germany through medicine, selling medicine from Halle. They would send him medicine and books. The Reformed Church also wanted books from Germany, and so he was able to sell not only to Lutherans but also outside of the Lutherans in the colonies. And Halle was known worldwide to be one of the places in the world for up-to-date medicines and for not the manufacture, but the making of medicines. So he was able to finance congregations and support congregations financially through the selling of medicine and books in the colonies. A couple of interesting stories. Let's see, what time is it? I need to make sure to leave by 10:45 in order to say thank you to Marie and Melissa for being co-Sunday school superintendents for 5 years, 4 to 5 years. A couple of interesting stories from Muhlenberg. One was a conflict in St. Michael's in Germantown. And this gives us a little bit of a bird's eye view into what it was like to be a congregation there. So the St. Michael's called Muhlenberg to be their pastor after he was established for a long time. This was a congregation that was in Germantown in Philadelphia. Well, we call it Philadelphia now. It was Germantown outside of Philadelphia. And there was a power struggle between parishioners, and some of the parishioners wanted a different pastor. So they ended up locking the trustees. They changed the locks of the building and locked the trustees who owned the mortgage and everything out of the building. The trustees were the ones who had called Muhlenberg, and so there was this whole struggle over that, and they decided to cut with Muhlenberg, the people who'd locked the trustees out of the building. The trustees decided to do something else, and the congregation called this other pastor, and it ended up kind of withering away. The pastor ended up not being a very good pastor, kind of looking back, if I can say that. And so that congregation kind of went back to the trustees eventually, and ended up being kind of under the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. So one of the things that Muhlenberg did then was, if you were a Ministerium of Pennsylvania congregation, if you were part of this network of congregations, this organization, right now we would say the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America is our organization of congregations. In Muhlenberg's time, what would happen would be that the mortgage, the deed, would go over to the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. It would not be held in the hands of a group of people in the congregation, so they wouldn't get stuck with it, and that a group of powerful parishioners couldn't run away with a congregation. The other thing that I find interesting, I'm listening to podcasts on colonial America and early America after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. And because I live in a house that was created in the late 1700s and I'm kind of learning all about that period of time, it's fascinating. But Muhlenberg struggled mightily over whether to side with the loyalists or the patriots in the War of American Independence. He really struggled mightily. Lutherans understand that God works through order and authority, and so there's that issue. Also, he got authority from the chaplain to the King of England in order to come over to the colonies. And so he really struggled with not only his own kind of loyalty and connection to the Prince of Hanover, the King of England, but also the theology of how do Lutherans understand how we live in a area, how we live in a land with a government that's separate from the church. And he really struggled with it. On the day before the deadline to sign to be a patriot, patriots and loyalists, he ended up signing to be a patriot. And we're not sure exactly what changed. We don't have that much research about that, I understand. But he decided to sign up along to be a patriot and not a loyalist. So, which is why I also struggle with movements that are especially using force against government. I have very strong hesitations, reticence, and wonder how God is working through that, as I understand that God to work through order and authority. Not absolutely. We look to God working through it, and we obey God over all authorities because we understand God is over all authorities. And if an authority, including government, is obviously or perceptively against, I understand God, the authority to be working against God's will, then I have to make a decision for God and not for order and authority, government. So the conclusion then is that this is kind of what we've inherited from the New Testament, from how Paul and the early Christians understood church to be not just one congregation, but to be a congregation in a whole area, a church in a whole area. I didn't mention this, but Paul's letters would get handed around from community to community in Galatia and in Ephesus. And the letter would be handed around to the different congregations, but it was the church there. So in the New Testament, in the early church, and from Muhlenberg, we understand that church isn't only one congregation, but as the ELCA has its tagline from the beginning, we're one church in three expressions: the congregation, the synod, which is the bishop, and the synod council, and the synod that meets in assembly every year, congregations, we just had that last week, and then the church-wide, which meets every 3 years now. And so the one church in three expressions, we couldn't exist really as we are without each other. The congregation wouldn't be able to call a pastor going through seminaries that the Synod and the ELCA funds for training and education. And the ELCA couldn't be on the ground spreading the gospel in Long Valley without Zion. And even more, we're also connected to the Lutheran World Federation, which is, there are member churches all across the world, including in Germany and Africa and South America and Central America and Europe and Russia and England. There are member Lutheran churches all around the world that are part of the Lutheran World Federation, as is the ELCA. And we'll learn a bit more in the fall now, because Adult Forum will end after next week. In the fall, we'll hear more about the history and the current joys and concerns of the ELCA and the Lutheran World Federation. I think next we'll look at how the ELCA became the ELCA. So we'll look at the 20th century history and how all of the immigrant Lutheran churches kind of merged into the ELCA, the biggest Lutheran body in the United States. So next week, we hear about COVID and worship, and we're led by Dr. Craig Dice and Victoria Stabile, who works with vaccines. And I'm having a mental block. It's not Pfizer, and it's not Moderna. I think it might be Merck, but I'm just having a mental block about that. So if you have questions for next week, click the Zoom link and participate, or send me any questions you might have. God's blessings.